So we'll begin the lymphatic system today. And here, if you look at, so just want you to look at this first picture, which is really nice. So here is the circulatory system which you did. So, you know, the heart, and you can see the arteries, and then they break up into capillaries, and then from the venous end of the capillaries, the veins go back and they take the blood back to the heart, right? Now, at this capillary end, if you remember, we saw how hydrostatic pressure throws fluid out and osmotic pressure drew fluid in. But some of the fluid still remains outside in the interstitial space which bathes the cells. That fluid is made up of plasma which has seeped out with lots of proteins in it, okay? That fluid is really lymph. And when it goes into capillaries, so these are the lymph capillaries, they start as blind-ended vessels. And you can see then they become, you know, like a capillary. So they are small, then they get larger, and they form large lymph vessels, and then they go back. And then that's how they return the blood, the extra tissue fluid back into circulation. And at different points, they are interrupted by lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes are such, they are like toll stations in between, so that any cell debris, pathogens, viruses, anything which needs to be taken care of, these lymph nodes can do that, okay? So I want you to kind of look at this picture, and then after a while we'll have a few questions on this. So let's look at the organs included in the lymphatic system. So you have two central organs. This is where actually in fetal life the different types of lymphocytes, they get mature and they are kind of primed. And the two central organs are the thymus, where T lymphocytes go to get mature. And then we have bone marrow, which we'll see when we do the immune system, where B lymphocytes form and they get primed and become mature. These are the other lymphatic organs. So we have tonsils. Normally you tend to think of tonsils when someone says, you know, you have inflammation of the tonsil, there's only one that you think of, and the one that you're thinking of is the palatine tonsil, which is, you know, you kind of loosely point to this area of your throat, and you think that when it's swollen, that's where it is. And what you're feeling when you actually press along your neck, you're not really feeling the tonsil. What you're feeling is a lymph node that the tonsil drains into. So if that palatine tonsil is inflamed, that lymph node will be swollen, and that's what the doctor is really feeling. So tonsils, also known as tonsillar tissue. So this is also often called tonsillar tissue. This is seen in the throat area, or what is anatomically correct is the pharynx. And we'll see that in different areas of the pharynx is where these tonsils lie. There are 4 named tonsils. You have the other little tonsillar tissue all around, but they are not named. The 4 named ones are lingual, which means on the tongue. Palatine, so this is the one which is the most common, which when it gets really big, you find it difficult to swallow. There's one called tubal tonsil, which is present in relation to the eustachian tube. So this is in relation to the eustachian, or what is also known as the auditory tube. And pharyngeal tonsil, which we'll see, which is on the posterior pharyngeal wall. This is the one which, when swollen, we call adenoids. Okay, when this is swollen, we call it adenoids. Then we have lymph nodes, so small bean-shaped structures. So here, what you can see, the tonsillar tissue is not really all that well seen, but you can see these lymph nodes up here. You can see all of these lymph nodes. Lymph nodes tend to collect in certain areas of the body. Some of the common areas where lymph nodes are collected are in the neck, where they are known as cervical lymph nodes. Then you see a big group of lymph nodes present in the axilla, called the axillary group of lymph nodes. And then you see lymph nodes in the groin area, known as the inguinal group of lymph nodes. You see a lot of lymph nodes which are present in the abdomen. So here within the abdominal organs also they are present there. They're called mesenteric lymph nodes, aortic lymph nodes, different names. But on the outer surface of the body, the ones you can actually feel are the cervical group of lymph nodes. And notice how everything kind of drains to a regional area. So anything to do with the head and neck, most of it will drain into the cervical group of lymph nodes. So if somebody has even lice in their hair and they scratch and infection occurs, it will be the cervical group of lymph nodes which will enlarge. If somebody has anything in the toe, foot, here or leg, you can see all of this drains, into maybe first popliteal, then they go up into the inguinal. So the lymph is going this way. So the inguinal group of lymph nodes will be enlarged. If someone has any problem in the upper limb or something in the thorax, it's the axillary group of lymph nodes which will, get enlarged. And then we have what are called lymphatic nodules. Nodules are also known as follicles. So these are round structures, lymphatic tissue, which is usually present. So it's lymphatic tissue made up of lymphocytes and macrophages. Main cells in the lymphatic system are lymphocytes and macros. So, these are the nuclei which you see. So it's in a round shape, but these nodules, or what we call follicles, are present as part of another organ. So they're in the wall of another organ. When they are in the wall of the small intestine, we call it the Peyer's patches, sometimes spelled with an E, an A and E, and sometimes just with an E. So here the Peyer's patches, these are present in the small intestine. They're given a special name. But otherwise, you might see lymphatic follicles present with relation to anything where there is exposure. For example, the respiratory tract, the gastrointestinal, other parts of the gastrointestinal tract other than small intestine, the urinary tract. So all of these, they're exposed at some point or the other to, outside, like respiratory tract. You breathe in air, you can take in stuff of gastrointestinal, you take all kinds of food, so pathogens can go in. Urinary tract infection could spread from below. So, all of these. So wherever there is the possibility of an infection, the body wants to protect it. So you have these aggregations or collections. In fact, most areas which have a blood supply invariably have a lymphatic drainage. Because lymph, what does it do? It just collects that tissue fluid, right, which has seeped out. Some areas which don't have lymph vessels are bone marrow, so that's one area, and even the brain. Even though the brain is well supplied with blood, it doesn't have any lymphatic vessels. Another organ is the spleen, very, very large organ, the largest lymphatic organ. And then, of course, the bone marrow. So let's answer a few questions here. Don't have So what is the direction of lymph flow? So you looked at the first picture. So see what is the direction of lymph flow. It is towards the heart, not away from the heart, or not both towards and away, because let's go back and let's look at that picture. Remember, lymph vessels take the lymph back, the fluid back into circulation, which means they are like veins. They are going back into the blood circulation. So notice how here, look at the direction it's going. It goes into a vein from above. Also, it's coming down and into veins. So it's towards the heart, okay? So it's towards the heart. And another thing you can see from this picture is the lymphatic vessels finally drain into veins. So that's another important thing for you to remember. So it finally drains into the veins, and that's how the blood goes back. All of the remaining fluid, which is an interstitial space, that fluid goes back into the circulation. Okay, I just gave you this. So where does lymph finally drain? Come on. Into veins, yes, into veins. It goes into veins. You noticed how it was opening into the veins, not into the extracellular space. It removes the fluid from the extracellular space, taking it back into the veins. Okay, so that's where lymph finally drains. Now let's look at the first of the lymphatic organs. So the thymus. It's a large lymphatic organ, especially in childhood and adolescence. You know, once you start hitting puberty, then this lymphatic organ begins to involute. Involute means it regresses. And in fact, if you look at a cadaver, you often find that this thymus is very difficult to see. It's just a thin strand. You can barely see it in the neck or in the thorax. It is said to be a bilobed organ, so there are like two lobes, this one big lobe and another one. They may not always be seen that well. Very vascular. This is the area where it's one of the central lymphatic organs. So during fetal life, which we'll see in the immune system, when these lymphocytes are being formed, the ones which are destined to form T lymphocytes, they go into the thymus to mature. So it makes the T lymphocytes immunocompetent. That means it trains them to become competent to take part in the immune response. It produces many hormones, of which thymosin is one of the really important ones. So you can see here there's a little review of all the things that have to do with the thymus. And if it is often involved in an autoimmune disease which is known as myasthenia gravis. So the thymus is to blame in this situation. Let's look at the histology of the thymus. So imagine that if you thought of these as the two lobes, so this is say one lobe and this is another lobe. What happens is the thymus has a capsule on the outside. Many organs have connective tissue which is present on the outside, which is called the capsule. And this capsule sends in little sort of septae inside. Septae are like little walls inside. So these are septae. This is a septum. Septum is singular. Septa or septae are plural. So when it sends these septae inside, it breaks each lobe itself into tinier bits which are known as lobules. And the periphery of the thymus is known as the cortex. It's much darker staining. So the cortex is darker staining. And here, this is the cortex. This part here, you can see the cortex is darker staining. The central area, which is lighter staining, is called the medulla. And what you can see in this picture, if you notice, the cortex is kind of confined to a lobule up here. Can you see that? The cortex is confined to a lobule. The medulla kind of spreads around, but it's still present only in the center. And in the medulla, right here, so this here is the medulla. So here, this is the cortex. This area here is the cortex. This part here is the medulla. And very characteristic of the medulla is the presence of these round pink structures, which you can see here, which are known as Hassel's corpuscles. So this is a very typical feature of the thymus. And if you look at Hassel's corpuscle, it really has an onion peel-like appearance. The cells actually are like this. They kind of, if you look at it in very high power, you'll be able to see this. The cells kind of lined like this. So can you see it kind of gives an onion peel-like appearance? The function of the Hassel's corpuscle is not known. They think it's probably the cells are dying in this area. And the reason why the cortex is much darker than the medulla is because the lymphocytes, if you remember when we were doing blood cells and we looked at a lymphocyte, and the nucleus of the lymphocyte is really dark, purplish, and the cytoplasm is very little on, like this. So most of the time you see just the nucleus. In the cortex, the nuclei are all very closely aggregated like this. So can you see they're very, very close to each other, which gives it a dark appearance. In the medulla, they're a little bit more spread out. So that's why you have this lighter appearance in the medulla, not as concentrated. One thing which is very also seen in the thymus, you have Hassel's corpuscles. Another thing is that you do not see any germinal centers. And in a later slide, when we talk of another organ, we'll talk about what germinal centers are. But in the medulla, you do not see, or in the thymus, you do not see any germinal centers. So here again, just a review. You have cortex and medulla, septate dividing it into lobules. Hassel's corpuscle seen in the medulla, but no germinal centers seen. The cortex is much darker than the central medulla. Okay, so characteristic feature are the Hassel's corpuscles and this cortex and medulla. Let's look at these tonsils. They are present in this area which is called the pharynx. What you loosely call your throat, that's the pharynx. And if you see, let's sort of demarcate the parts of the pharynx. So this is the nose, nasal cavity. This is the oral cavity, and this part here is the larynx. So this is the nasal cavity here. This is the oral cavity. And this here is the larynx. So if we draw a line from where the posterior part of your nose ends, at this point where the nose ends, we also draw a line through folds. When you open your mouth and you look at the back of your tongue, you can see two folds which go from the soft palate down to the tongue, right? So at the beginning of the first of those folds, and you take the line across from just crossing the larynx this way, all this area here is called the pharynx. This part which is behind the nose is known as nasopharynx. This part which is behind the oral cavity is called oropharynx. And this part which is behind the larynx is called laryngopharynx. So it automatically tells you what it is behind. And notice here in the nasopharynx, you can see these are the two tonsillar tissues that I'm trying to show you. This one which is over the auditory tube, this is known as the tubal tonsil. So this one here, this green bit, it's over the auditory tube. It's called tubal. That's why it's called tubal tonsil. So it's above the auditory or eustachian tube, or also called pharyngotympanic tube. Auditory tube or eustachian tube, or also called pharyngotympanic tube. This is a really good name, pharyngotympanic, because it connects this nasopharynx to the middle ear cavity. That's why it's called pharyngotympanic. Nasopharynx to middle ear cavity. Pharynx to tympanum is the middle ear. So this lies over the tube, eustachian tube. And here on the posterior wall of the nasopharynx is this pharyngeal tonsil, which when swollen, it's called adenoids. And you can understand if it swells really too much, if it swells a lot, can you see like this? It will become really swollen and big. What will happen when this child is breathing? They find it difficult to breathe, because can you see this passage has become really narrow? So very often these children who have swollen pharyngeal tonsils, they have difficulty breathing. They sleep with their mouth open or breathe with their mouth open because then, it cannot go through the nose. Growth becomes a little stunted because, again, a lot of problems they have, and you have to remove those tonsils. Then when you look at the oropharynx, you have a tonsil which is present in between those two folds which come down from the pharynx. That is the palatine tonsil, the one that you actually look at when you open your mouth and you stare inside and you see those two swellings in your pharynx. That's the one you're really looking at, the palatine tonsil here. And then there is a single one which is present just under the tongue. If you look at the back of your tongue, it kind of looks a little like it's not smooth. It kind of looks like a little bumpy. And that's because of tonsillar tissue which is present underneath, and that's the lingual tonsil, okay? So you have one pharyngeal tonsil here, one lingual, but these other tubal and palatine are paired. So together they form a ring around your pharynx, which you can see here, which is known as the Waldeyer's ring. So if you start from the top, and this is the pharyngeal tonsil, so here pharyngeal tonsil, you go to the side, this is tubal tonsil. Then you come down to the palatine tonsil, and then you come down to the lingual tonsil. So this is one side, and then we'll go back again to palatine, tubal, and then back to the center. So can you see this tonsillar ring around in your pharynx, which is known as the Waldeyer's ring? Okay? So let's stop here.